Good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome to this webinar, EU-Africa Partnership, What's Next, Towards an African Stability Mechanism. I'm Cinzia, I'm Director of Research at the CEPS in Brussels. I'm very pleased to moderate this event, which is organized in partnership with the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, who is actually taking care of the organization of this event. I'm very pleased to moderate this event because of the topic we will be discussing today, as well as the excellent lineup of speakers. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So let me say just a couple of words to set the scene about the purpose of this event and the reason why we decided to discuss EU-Africa partnership. As many of you may know, in February 2022, we had in Brussels the meeting of the head of states and governments of the European Union and the African Union. This happened after 2 years, basically, of delay due to COVID. And basically, the meeting was, of course, important and claimed a renewed, partnership. On the other side, there is a bit of a sense that despite an agreement on how to address short-term challenges, there was not really a renewed and concrete set of measures to address challenges. And when it comes to the challenges, if anything, in the last couple of years, these have increased a lot. I mean, of course, COVID represented a major shock to the global economy, to advanced economies, as well to Africa, where basically the vaccination rate is still very low. But I think in addition to this, and what is maybe more concerning is that some of the fragilities which basically came about during COVID are now being reinforced, if you want to amplify it, because of the global economic context. On the one hand, triggered by the war in Ukraine and a really very different macroeconomic context with rising prices globally. So for different reasons, but inflation is rising globally. And where the risk of stagnation, so lower growth, is actually increasing. So we are now in a context where stability, but also economic stabilization come about as important topics for discussion if we want to basically look into the future in a way which is constructive and where basically growth remains at the center. So it is against this background that we managed to organize a very rich panel, and for this I'm very grateful to Ayadi, my dear friend. She is very much behind the scene of this event, and she will have actually the opportunity to present some concrete ideas. But I would like first to start with our first panelist, Erika Gerritsen. She's head of unit at DG IMPA, International Partnerships at the European Commission. Erika, I would like to ask you what basically came out from the summit, and what can we expect as next steps in this EU-Africa partnership? Erika, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cinzia, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to have this discussion today, which I am sure will be extremely stimulating intellectually for us all as a group, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the views of the different panelists and the participants to this event. Thanks for giving me the floor, and Cinzia, indeed you already in the broad lines introduced the fact that the summit which took place between the EU and Africa in February, which was the first one in 2 years, and has brought together 27 heads of states from Europe and 40 heads of states from Africa. It has been a very strong moment in the partnership, and indeed a strong signal of a renewed relationship between our continents. The delivery on the summit's commitments is indeed now the challenge that we are facing. The declaration of the summit is extremely rich, actually, with many strands of work which have been discussed, agreed upon at the highest level between our heads of states, and which oblige us moving forward into implementation. And actually, this summit's commitments, whereby we wish to create sustainable links between our two continents, these commitments are even more urgent now after the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, which indeed is having a lot of consequences, of course, on Europe, but also, of course, on the African continent, with in particular the different aspects that you already mentioned. So we are also in particular facing now a very high risk of a food crisis, and hence need to build resilient food systems, but also cut on dependencies on fossil fuels. And for this, we need to massively invest in renewables. And of course, we need to bring peace and development to all on the continents of Africa and of Europe. And this will need to go through multilateral solutions, and this objective has to converge on the multilateral stage. This is the spirit in which we are working in the follow-up of the summit. The summit has also agreed on the Global Gateway Africa-Europe investment package, which comes with 150 billion euros of investments, exactly in the spirit of the core objectives that I just mentioned. This is a unique offer for investments to be rooted in the principles of sustainability, rule of law, as well as a human-centric approach. So as agreed during the summit, and now really going more into the specifics of it, that it has been agreed between the leaders of the EU and the AU to monitor the progress of the summit commitments. It was really strongly felt that the intention was to go beyond commitments, but really to go to concrete action. And this is what we are currently working on, both at political level, but also at the technical level, with specific technical groups meeting together and following up on different topics. From my side here, and looking at the topics of today, I would like to concentrate on three dimensions. First, on the debt dimension. As we know, the debt levels were already in Africa, and in low-income countries in particular, were already very high before COVID, and COVID has only put more pressure on fiscal space in African countries. Some countries have been able to put forward impressive packages of support to the populations and the most vulnerable in the COVID context, but this has come with a heavy cost. And this, coupled with the needs of financing infrastructure and investing, is now coming to the point that we are having a debt crisis looming. During this period, we as EU have been working strongly in the multilateral arena, and it is good to see that the summit declaration and statement states exactly that we, that is the African and Europeans together, we support the common framework for debt treatment beyond the DSSI. However, for now, only 3 countries in Africa have actually applied to the common framework, and you know them well. It's Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia. This is too little, and of course we therefore need to together question the capacity of this instrument to clearly attract more countries to come into this framework for debt restructuring. And for this, we as EU, we have put forward a few suggestions in the context of the G20. it is really important to have all the bilateral creditors around the table of debt discussions and debt restructuring, and to engage constructively in order to advance on the ongoing country cases. We need to bring greater clarity on timelines and procedures related to this process, because uncertainty creates this effect whereby countries are not really willing to go into this because they are afraid of the impact this might have on the attitudes of the markets, and rightly so. And third, we need to have a greater outreach, both from the IMF, the World Bank, towards low-income countries on the features of the common framework. And beyond that, we also believe that in some cases, it might also be useful for middle-income countries to be associated to the process. This being said, while we are having this debt crisis, we also need to have the financing of infrastructure, renewable energy, health infrastructure, education in Africa, so as to put the continent back on the track of the SDGs. And the investment package is exactly aimed at that. But more concretely, there was a call and a major act in August of 21 with the new allocation of SDRs. And these new SDRs for 650 billion SDRs, which have been allocated to all the IMF members. There was a strong call from the EU, and in particular in the summit on the financing of African economies, which has been organized by President Macron a year ago, a strong call for rechanneling of SDRs, setting even this target of $100 billion of rechanneling. So far, we are at $74 billion US dollars pledged for rechanneling from more advanced economies towards low-income countries. Out of the 74 billion, 20 billion are coming from the EU. We are not yet at the 100 billion target, and this might be something that we could discuss in the course of today's discussion. And for now, as you know, the rechanneling happens mostly through the two IMF facilities, the PRGT and the newly established Resilience and Sustainability Trust. A third option was also planned in the initial papers related to the SDRs and their reallocations. And again, I suppose that this is something that we could discuss today. And lastly, speaking about investments, it's also about public money, using public money and collecting public money. We as EU, we use this motto of collect more, spend better. More than ever, we are strongly engaged into this agenda of strong public finance management governance, and the declaration of the summit has pretty strong language on illicit financial flows, and we are very much looking forward to continuing the work and deepening the work in a Team Europe spirit with the African Union on illicit financial flows, and beyond this on domestic revenue mobilization and anti-money laundering. So these are really the few axes that I wanted to set first in terms of first orientations. So work is really happening at technical level now to build Team Europe initiatives with the African partners around many topics, and I just wanted to focus here on those aspects that I mentioned. So thanks for now, Cinzia, and over to you.
Many thanks, Erika. I think this was a really short but very focused overview of these three main points. And actually, I would like to start from your point on that to move to our second speaker. And this is Emmanuel Moreira. Is Director of the Economic Department at the African Development Bank Group, and also Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Many thanks, Emmanuel, for taking the time to be with us. As I mentioned, I would like to link to the point on that, basically making reference to the fact that In 2021, the African Development Bank called for a comprehensive plan for debt restructuring, but also with the idea of having a financial stability mechanism, an homegrown financial stability mechanism, if I understand correctly, to mutualize funds and to basically mutualize available funds to ensure that spillovers from external shocks do not affect too many countries. So I would like to ask you to elaborate a bit on this idea of a financial stability mechanism and how it links to the debt issue. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. Thank you, colleagues, for participating to this meeting. Let me just perhaps say that I will have 3 points. The first one being to kind of give a background of the African financial stability mechanism that the African Development Bank is actually putting in place. First, as we all know, and Erika actually mentioned it during her presentation, Africa is today in its second wave of indebtedness. The first wave started in 1970, right? Between 1970 and 1980, African countries went into a lot of debt, which actually led to the so-called heavily indebted poor country initially by the World Bank, the IMF, in 1996, as they put in place the HIPC, even the enhanced HIPC. And then in 2005, the international community came up with the MDRI, multilateral debt relief initiative. Myself, I was at the World Bank when those initially, by the way, were put in place. And I was lucky enough to actually lead the debt relief for countries such as Niger, and I also involved in the debt relief for the DRC, Congo, Brazzaville, and so forth when I was at the IMF. So first wave of debt, 1970s, 1980s, Golding, HIPC, MDRI. But since 2010, unfortunately, the debt is back. Keep in mind that in the 1990s, after MDRI, until 2000, let's say 2009, the debt to GDP ratio dropped a lot in Africa, less to 40% of GDP, which is good. But since 2010, the debt actually skyrocketed. Today, Africa has a debt to GDP ratio of about 70% of GDP, 70%, 71%, or sometimes 72%, according to the data IMF, World Bank, or African Development Bank. But as Erika mentioned it, and we need to be clear, the increase of debt is not just due to COVID-19. It is true that between 2019 and 2020, the debt to GDP ratio increased, for instance, for North African countries by 12 percentage points, in sub-Saharan Africa by 6 percentage points. But the debt actually started since, I was saying, in 2010. So we also know that COVID-19 hit a lot of African economies, right? The continent went into its worst recession in 4 decades. If you look at the real GDP growth in Africa since 1970, today, this was the first time in 2020 that the continent actually went into recession with real GDP growth negative or minus 1.5% according to the African Development Bank data, compared to 3.3% in 2019. But the most important issue from my perspective is the increase of the debt. But not only the level, but also the structure of the debt has completely changed. Keep in mind that in 1970, 1990, the debt was more owed to bilateral creditor members of Paris Club, see, and multilateral creditor like the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth. So it was easy to come up with the HIPC and the MDRI. But today, the debt is owed to commercial, it's a commercial debt and owed to bilateral creditor not member of Paris Club, like for instance, China, India, and so forth, which complicated the issue. The international community came up with the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which is not terrific, right? It's just suspending, is delaying the payment of the service of debt. As a matter of fact, this initiative actually is over. Came up with the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment. But as Erika said again, this initiative is not even working properly. And if you look at even the declaration by Kristalina Georgieva herself, who was actually my CEO when I was at the World Bank before moving to the IMF, Kristalina herself, even David Malpass, they made it clear that the common framework is not really working, and we need to do something about it. As Erika said, only 3 countries, Chad, Ethiopia, Zambia, actually decided to. And when they decided to adhere to the common framework, Ethiopia was immediately downgraded by the credit agency. So keep in mind that many African countries now are kind of reluctant, and I can tell you because I'm dealing with the 54 African countries, right? Because I'm covering the whole continent. When we have your discussion about debt restructuring, about the common framework, what the Minister of Finance actually tell us, to say, well, we are not sure about this thing, we don't want to give, and I even say, when I even went to present the president with some of the head of state, some of them say, well, we don't want to be involved in it because we're going to send the wrong signal to the market that perhaps we cannot pay our debt. So my point is here is that the DSSI, the common framework, are not really, were not very successful. This is where we came up with the idea, this is my second point, of putting in place an Africa Financial Stability Mechanism, which is a mechanism not only to address the issue of debt resolution by providing liquidity, quick liquidity to countries which may be in difficult situation, but also preventing the debt issue, the vulnerability coming from the debt to occur in the first place. So the mechanism will be not only a debt crisis resolution mechanism, but also a debt crisis prevention mechanism. And we know that this mechanism is not new. This exists around the world. For instance, the Arab Monetary Fund, the Eurasian Development Fund, the Chiang Initiative for Multilateralization, the Fondo Latinoamericano de Reservas, so mean the Latin American Reserve Fund, the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the European Stability Mechanism, which is actually the one which is well known. So this is what we're trying to put in place with the rationale that we could not only prevent those crises to occur, but also give a platform for African countries to negotiate their debt. Because keep in mind that when African countries go to negotiate their debt, even at Paris Club, they go by themselves, or when they want to try to discuss debt restructuring or reprofiling, whatever it is, with China, for instance, they go by themselves. The African Financial Stability Mechanism can offer that platform for them to really negotiate that. And it will also give a strong signal to the market that, to the financial market, that African Development Bank and Africans themselves are taking this thing seriously and not just leaving to the IMF and the World Bank. And another advantage of putting this in place is the fact that it will foster the implementation of convergence criteria in some of the regional bodies in Africa, for instance, UMOA, COAS, SADC, and so forth. So there are many advantages, and I'm actually leading that technical team which is working, and I interact a lot. I've been interacting a lot with not only the European Stability Mechanism. I went myself to Luxembourg to meet with them, also with the Arab Monetary Fund, with BRICS Contingent Reserve, and so forth. There are some of the issues that perhaps to the interest of time I may not be able to cover, and perhaps I can come back, is what could be the relationship between the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism that we wanted to put in place and, for instance, the IMF, because we still know that when it comes to financial stability, international scene is still the IMF, which has the mandate. What would be also the relationship with the African Development Bank? How do we design conditionality, for instance, surveillance, where the resources will come from? These are the kind of issue that I may come back to to share with you. Let me perhaps just stop here as an introductory remark. So I hope that I give you a kind of flavor of what the African Financial Stability Mechanism looks like, and we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Emmanuel. I think it was very clear and was very useful to put into perspective about what is going on with debt, how the structure of debt in Africa has changed over time, and what would be the purpose of this mechanism. And this actually, this topic offers me a link to the next speaker, Kari Koronen. He is a senior advisor to the Secretary General at the European Stability Mechanism. Emmanuel mentioned that the European Stability Mechanism, Kari started to work at the ESM in 2013, so at the very beginning. Kari is really an expert on policy evaluation. So I thought that actually it could give us some insights on how the ESM was set up, what has been the experience with the action of the ESM, and how this could offer maybe lessons really learned on experience for the build-up, the setup of a stabilization mechanism in Africa. Kari, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cinzia, for the invitation. Yeah, indeed, maybe it's good to start by saying, putting a bit more of a framework. The ESM is what is called a regional financing arrangement. And of course, in our case, focusing on countries that use the euro as their currency. And there are other arrangements in other regions, and maybe as a reference point, it's good to mention the ASEAN +3 arrangement in Asia, the Arab Monetary Fund, and say the Latin American Reserve Fund, for example. These, together with the IMF and the central bank swap lines, they also form what is called this global financial safety nets, and it's a layered arrangement, all financial that in the end work together. So ESM was established in the middle of the crisis and euro area crisis, and as a follow-up to the global financial crisis. And this clearly sort of describes also the arrangement itself. We were set up running first as a very, I would say, tiny temporary arrangement, and then developed into a permanent international organization. They were very fast, hands-on, raising financing from the markets to the members who were in need of financing. So this is I think a large characteristic of the institution. Even if ESM is an international institution, it is ingrained in EU cooperation, and the programs were really actually designed by the European Commission together with the IMF contributions and European Central Bank, of course. But this slow evolution also reflects on how things can evolve later on, and I think that's important also to remember in the African case. It matters how you start. But one can still characterize ESM as a rather strong institution, and I would say that there are three main reasons for that, and I'd like to highlight those. So first of all, the organization is based on a standing treaty that sets a clear accountability to the member states. Our legal framework is not only about providing the finance, but it also allows us to establish post-program monitoring which is really important for the institution that extends long-term financing to a member. Because many reforms that come with as a support to the financing, they may take a long time to implement. So it's quite important that one manages to follow that and ensure means for repayment in the budget funding of a member. So the first ESM evaluation, actually, this report, I don't know if you can actually see it very well. It's the first 2017 evaluation. It also prompted a more sort of preventive role for the ESM. It's again an issue that shows that the arrangements may evolve over time. The second point for the strength of the organization is the financial structure. And in financial terms, ESM is the largest of the regional arrangements. So a very high shareholder support, which is reflected also in the sizable capital call arrangement for increase of capital in case of need, increases the credibility of the organization. And our financial management also builds on extremely strong liquidity management. So we are potentially very quick to provide assistance as well. Of course, the robustness of the European crisis fighting infrastructure is another element that strengthens this kind of an arrangement. So with buffer funds that the Commission has now established with member states, the NGEU and the ECB's new instruments, they have actually preserved the ESM's firepower for the most crucial events. For example, Moody's just noted this as a big advantage. So we've also been able to program large contingency buffers in the programs. So that also provides a way to restore confidence to countries once they are assisted. So in addition to this EU cooperation framework, of course, what also matters for us is that we can benefit from high confidence EU statistics and supervisory frameworks. And finally, there's the international cooperation. So beyond EU, ESM has built this network of regional financing arrangements that allows us to also learn from each other's crises. And compare benefits, you know, what works and what doesn't. Now, how is this relevant for Africa? I guess is the question. I have a couple of minutes. So I would say that Africa, of course, one can see much larger diversity than between the countries than in Europe. And the number of members, if you would put them all in one institution, becomes very high, to the order of 50 countries. That creates a different dynamic than, say, 20 in our case. There are also multiple currency arrangements that have gained, you know, various degrees of integration processes. A few countries would also be conflict affected. There have been social unrests in quite a few countries in the last 3-4 years. So it is a different environment to operate. In many countries, obviously, as was already said, the institutions still require quite a lot of strengthening work. And I think that technical sort of support from outside the region would be a very important element of the operation of this kind of an arrangement. So maybe finally then just mention that financial markets, of course, are quite different, and that also would the depth of financial markets has helped us to actually leverage market financing for our programs. Now, the question is, how would Africa be able to do that? So I think this poses the question on how the new institution's mandate would be defined. What would be the priorities? In reality, there are lots of potential things to do. So the prioritization would be very important, I think. And how would you secure consistent treatment of members at over time and place as well? I think these are key points to keep in mind. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kari, for highlighting the main features of the ESM, the challenges that they had to address, but also how actually the differences compared to in Africa compared to the EU should be taken into consideration when setting up a potential new institution. But I'm sure we will come back to these points later on. I would like to move now to the next speaker, and this is Rim Ayadi. She's the president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, and she is also professor at the Bayes Business School. Rim, you have been working on first on the North African and MENA region for quite some years, decades. Bit more than a decade, and now interest has extended also to Africa. You know some of these countries very well. You have been thinking a lot how to address the recent challenges, which are increasing, and you came out with a proposal. So I would like to give you the floor to share your thoughts on what could be done concretely to address at least some of the current challenges. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Cinzia, for this introduction. Yes, I was listening very carefully to Erika, Emmanuel, and Kari. And I think the challenges are quite global nowadays, specifically on the issue of indebtedness. The COVID-19, practically, as you all mentioned, has exacerbated the indebtedness problems. And beyond that, the war in Ukraine has also pushed, or will push, or is pushing the global debt level even higher. If we look at the volume of global indebtedness, which include the government, businesses, and households, altogether, based on the data from the IMF, these are almost reaching 300 trillions in 2021. They went above, actually they went above from 226 trillion in 2022. So the increase is quite dramatic over this 1 year. And I expect that 2022, the global debt levels will be even higher. Obviously, there are some countries that are much more problematic than others. And this is something that needs to be very carefully looked at. Now, if we look at the advanced economies, they have the capacity to borrow because there have been on a very low interest rates and risk premium for many reasons. And also they have a much higher capacity to service their debt, particularly the external part of it. And this is quite important. Now, in emerging economies and low and middle income countries, they are facing much tighter limits, which also limits their ability to carry additional debt, while also they have been, or some of them have been, at the risk of default, and they have defaulted, or they have restructured, and can name Zambia, Argentina, now Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and the list, it's growing. Now, in 2021, we all knew that we were hoping for a benign macroeconomic scenario where interest rates might remain low. everything will work to combat the pandemic. And then we were hoping for a recovery and future growth plan that will bring our global economies and the developing countries' economies back into their feet. The reality is completely different because in 2022, with the war in Ukraine and the sluggish growth, increasing or fast increased inflation, which we wanted inflation before, but now it's going too fast. And also the risk of stagflation, you mentioned the stagnation, plus debt, high debt levels, potentially debt crisis. Now, of course, all of this is becoming a serious threat on the global economy and financial systems, particularly for regions like Africa, Mediterranean South, and so on. Even in the Eurozone, there are some concerns. And we could see also the recent jump in risk premium in government bonds of Greece and Italy, which prompted, in fact, the ECB to start thinking about some innovative instruments to buy some debt from the government to address this extreme market or potential extreme market turmoil. Now, the low-income countries, so this was said by Emmanuel, I think the composition of the debt has completely changed over the years. The external debt positions is held by investment funds or other private sector players. And some of those countries are being in a distress and almost close to distress. So in fact, if we move into a messy and disorderly default, then this will put a lot of pressure on the countries because they will not be able to recover fast. It will take them maybe 2 or 3 decades to recover and to gain or regain access to the financial market. So the next player, or at least for me, the additional player in the whole debate of restructuring and default is the private sector. So we cannot have the private sector outside the debate of the whole dynamic, particularly that if the markets and the global economy goes into major distress or debt distress, everybody will lose. Now, in 2021, IMF called for an urgent reform of the international debt architecture, and I call the 3 main pillars of the reform, just to remind ourselves. And these are debt relief, strengthening the contractor provisions via the extension of collective action clauses for non-bonded debt, enhanced by clauses that lower the debt payments and automatically suspend debt services. So this has been written by the IMF and accepted. And third, to enhance the debt transparency, to facilitate restructuring, know the picture, and also the resolution of decisions and actions. I think debt transparency, in my view, it's paramount to be able to assess the magnitude of the problem. And then this is a prerequisite condition for the private sector to even move forward into any debate or any contribution on the debt restructuring or debt relief. Now, the DSSI, and it has been said already, has addressed some of the problems of the debt relief for many low-income countries, but the framework expired last year at December, and it was in a way, I wouldn't say replaced, almost replaced by the common framework, which does not seem to work, and this has been confirmed by the managing director of the IMF, also mentioned by Emmanuel, and I think this is a serious issue that needs to be tackled at G20 this year in Indonesia. Now, I'm not going to go again on what the African Development Bank is proposing, and I think this is a very sensible proposal to stabilize. But of course, the question that remains is, that has been already addressed by Emmanuel, and I think this question should be really seriously addressed and try to accelerate as much as possible this financial stability mechanism at African level. But I even add another question. It's not only about Africa. There is also the Mediterranean, the countries that are not within the African continent. So that's the Middle Eastern part, which probably we need to think eventually how to have similar mechanisms that could also stabilize those countries, probably with different or innovative mechanisms, but in my view, they should not be excluded from the whole debate. Now, in Europe, you mentioned the ESM has been working pretty nicely, also supported by the ECB operations. And I think for the Mediterranean and Africa, and within the Euro-Mediterranean and Africa partnership, exploring this type of structures nowadays is essential to really create stabilization mechanisms and also growth or investment mechanisms that could really put the continent and the region into a path of recovery, peace and prosperity. And all of us need this going forward. So I think, of course, the ESM has a very strong institutional setting, and it has been working over the last decade, and it showed its capability to deal with the distressed countries. Now, I want to make, and we have been working over the last couple of years, not only on debt transparency, and I know that now the OECD is developing this global registry on debt for low-income countries, and this should be also extended to middle-income countries and enhance the granularity of the exposures. Now, my proposal, and I shared this with within this Indonesian G20 this year, is to extend the timeline of the DSSI until global recovery post-COVID-19 is resumed and the war in Ukraine ends, hopefully with a peace deal with Russia, and also to enlarge the eligibility criteria to middle-income countries. Of course, these include many countries in the Mediterranean and Africa. Now, of course, as I mentioned, need to have a contribution of the private sector. The DSSI should also engage systematically with the private sector to contribute to debt relief efforts and get their engagement that the countries benefiting from debt relief will not be excluded from capital market for further issuance whenever their situation is put back into normality. Now, the common framework, it will take time for it to become a more permanent instrument. It can be that it could inherit the temporary nature of the DSSI at a later stage. But in fact, it has to improve clarity, more transparency, clear roadmap to the countries to engage in debt relief negotiations. So I believe that this will take time and we need to act fast. And I believe that the DSSI extension for another year would be a way forward for low and middle income countries. But then again, countries that access to I'll call it the extended DSSI, hopefully must credibly commit to register all form of its debt or new debt issuance on the OECD debt transparency repository. Now, another proposal which is linked to what I was saying is to complement because you have the debt relief mechanism, but then what is interesting is to complement the DSSI with a public-private SDG compliant financing plan as part of a global recovery post-COVID-19, and also to accelerate the transition towards net zero scenario, and also fully comply, hopefully, with the SDGs principle. So this can, in fact, this mechanism could eventually be needed, but this has to be very carefully structured, that it helps restructuring some of the debt, piles of debt and interest, and to finance also the sustainable recovery up to 2050. So what is the mechanism, I would say, of this fund? Is practically will act as a form of partial guarantee or total guarantee, depends. I mean, but that's a bit needs to be defined. Probably between 40 to 80%, issued by eventually this Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is already channeling a lot of resources there. And also, it has the capability or financial capacity thanks to SDR allocation. So these guarantees will help the needing countries to issue long-term maturity debt up to 30 to 50 years for recovery. So we call them the recovery bonds, but the key issue is with lower interest rates. So then hopefully the interest rate on the dollar and the euro will not go up very fast. And this is also, the global economy is all interlinked to each other. So our idea is to have this interest rate much lower than, in fact, what is the market rate. And this should be in a way, the market could also be in a way subsidizing these risks. So this will do what, in fact? It will transform the existing unpaid debt of those countries, and also to finance the recovery plans post-COVID-19, and also the sustainable transition in line with the SDGs. Obviously, there should be very careful monitoring on the use of funds. This is also something that might be debatable by certain countries. But I think the key issue is to know that those funds are really serving the purpose of recovery and further investment. But what is also essential to get the, I would say, the commitment of the private sector is that they put a written commitment to provide affordable liquidity within a period of time to these countries. Now, again, all of this is a theoretical proposal because, in fact, the DSSI is expired. The Resilience and the Sustainability Trust recently set up, in fact, by the IMF. It's not set to do this. So if you get into the conditions of the RST, it's very complex even to access this type of fund. So the idea here, if all of this works, is to have very close coordination between the DSSI, the RST, and also the IIF, means the International Institute of Finance, so representing the private sector. And then, in fact, this coordination must be achieved via a three-party task force with the country in difficulty to co-design this comprehensive financing approach for recovery, resilience, and sustainable transition. So this, in fact, would be considered as a private-public partnership collective approach to avoid massive defaults of countries that are succumbing in reality or pushed outside the markets and even growth path because of the COVID also and the war in Ukraine. So this is practically what the proposal is, but then the EU could also work very carefully within this process and also eventually try to get into a parallel task force to use some of the funding that Enrique mentioned, the 150 billion, under also what is there in the multi-financial framework and the Team Europe to issue this certain type of guarantees or partial guarantees. And then obviously this will create what I call the global framework for recovery, for first of all recovery, of course, and then resilience and growth, which will bring Africa and the Mediterranean country into a growth, prosperity, and resilience path. And this is all, I think, in collaboration with Europe, with the other international organizations, and obviously schemes like the ones of the ESM that worked very nicely in Europe could be an example, as many examples that have worked in other regions of the world. That's it. Thank you, Cinzia.
Thanks a lot, Rim, for sharing your thoughts and the elements of your proposal. Some aspects are very concrete. You mentioned several times the key role of the private sector. It is for this reason that now I would like to move to our last panelist. Paolo Garonna is the Secretary General of the Italian Banking, Insurance and Finance Federation. Paolo is also a professor at Louis University. And I would like to ask you, what is your point of view? How do you see a role for the private sector in this process of moving towards a renewed partnership between the EU and Africa, and maybe also in relation to the proposal that Reem mentioned? Paolo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cinzia, and thank you to the organizers of this very interesting panel discussion, where you not only raise, I think, fundamental questions, but also I think you provide a lot of very concrete and specific answers in terms of proposals. So I think it is very, very constructive indeed. I want to get straight to the question that you asked, because it's an important question, and start from looking at the financing gaps that we are facing. Because I think if you want to be credible, we have to make the resources that are available match what is required. And what is required is, I think Cinzia also said this, it's not simply stopgap measures, emergency relief, response to crisis, but we need really to make a major effort in terms of investment, in terms of vision itself, on a framework of infrastructures for Africa, in terms of energy and energy security, in terms of food security, the twin transitions, the green transitions, with all the problems of droughts and the protection of nature, biodiversity, desertification, and the know-how, transfer of know-how, human capital, provision of jobs. So I think we are, I've heard before a few figures, 300 trillion of accumulated debt, there are, but you see, if you want, the trick is, how do you translate? How do you translate the millions into billions? How do you translate the billions into trillions euro? And because I think, the public resources are always going to be in a way insufficient. And the paradox is that in the private sector, in the market, you have savings, you have liquidity, you have investors in search for yields and good investment opportunities. So I think you have to mobilize private capital. Now, we all know that mobilizing private capital requires a lot of conditions. And I want to focus only, for the sake of brevity and prioritization, I would like only to identify three of them. Let me start from the domestic market conditions, the role of African players, the home, you call it homegrown mechanisms. Yes, you have to start from there. You need to develop banking, insurance, and capital markets in Africa, in the different countries of Africa, at the local level, at the continental level, and you have to integrate them, because I think they can only work if they are integrated across, and they are integrated also with global capital markets. So you have to create an ecosystem of financial intermediaries, following the whole financial escalator, from startups, scale-ups, and then credit, and then the financial centers, institutional investors, pension funds, the credit guarantees you were talking about, the equity, the recapitalization of the corporate sector, in particular the SMEs sector, listing, etc., etc. So I think you have to have this holistic approach, starting from the African markets and linking African capital, savings, banking markets across to the rest of the world. The second priority, in my view, is to look at this question into a Europe-Africa partnership. Is the title of our seminar. We need the Europe-Africa financial integration. This cannot be done. The concept is very simple. This cannot be done by African players, African resources alone. There must be also external inputs. There must be also partnerships. And I think Europe, I mentioned Europe, that because I think it's best placed for playing this role, not only for economic, financial proximity reasons, but also for geostrategic reasons. Europe has a vested interest in promoting African stability and prosperity. We need to avoid disruptive spillovers, and so I think the African markets should be increasingly integrated with in terms of private players with the European ones, and in Europe, you know, we are concerned and fully aware of the risks, also the opportunities that can come from a closer and mutually beneficial partnership with our African neighbors. The third condition, and I will stop there, is what the partnership that we require from the private sector and the public sector. The two have to work really in an integrated fashion. We have institutions, we have policies, we must make them work together and with the private sector. The European Union, the African Union. You mentioned the Regional Development Bank. It's very important. They play a very important role. The EBRD, the ADB, the Exim Bank, the ESM, and an African Stability Mechanism. I think you mentioned, for instance, how the challenging SDRs, which is still underway, is not complete yet, could be also done via regional development banks, and not only top down from the IMF. So this is required not only in terms of resources and provision of financial resources, but also in terms of planning, monitoring, evaluating, and with a close involvement of the private sector, and also with a lot of innovation. We need, you know, creative, pragmatic, innovative mechanisms like the one that Rim was telling us about, the one proposed by EMEA. So we need that kind of innovation, and this can come from public-private partnerships. Conclusion, I think really that we need to think in holistic terms of recovery and resilience plans for Africa, and for the European Union, for that matter, for the pan-European region, seeing the Euro-Mediterranean as in its bridging role between Europe and Africa. So I think, you know, need in terms of kind of Marshall Plan, the recovery and resilience plan for Africa. And I repeat, I think Europe is best placed and should be at the forefront of providing those resources. And I repeat, it's not simply a question of resources, but providing integration opportunities, financial integration, but also trade, investment, and sustainable development opportunities.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for this holistic kind of approach that you proposed. So a lot of elements that should be work at the same time in order to create really an ecosystem and environment which is more favorable to the action or the involvement of the private sector. I would like now to go back to the panelists for some reaction, and I would like to start with Emmanuel. I would like you to maybe to react a bit to what Kari said, you know, how the ESM evolved, and whether you think some elements could be useful for an African stability mechanism. But I would like also to ask you to react to what Rim said about the proposal of this partnership, and at the same time also what Paolo said. I mean, what is required for the private sector to be part of the game, which I think it's very important. We can't rely only on institutional actors, so markets need to be part of this discussion. Emmanuel, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. I think Kari raised a very, very important point. As a matter of fact, these are the points we have been discussing with your colleague from the ESM. For instance, as I said myself, I went to Luxembourg, I talked to Nicolas. As a matter of fact, colleagues from ESM are part of the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism. For instance, Heitor Ayers, who used to work as the ESM, or Françoise Blondel, they are actually working with me very closely. I think you raised very important point today. First of all, we have 54 African countries. It's going to be difficult to sell, and I'm myself seeing how difficult it is for instance, organize those focal points in each of the countries. We had a discussion, for instance, the Egyptian or Nigerian, they don't have necessarily the same approach like, let's say, countries which belong to the safer zone. See, and when we had a discussion, for instance, with the PCAO, at some point they even mentioned that, as you were suggesting, well, why don't we go with a two-pronged approach? Mean that, well, we go with countries such as WIMO countries, which already have a single currency, same language, they speak French. See, but when I say that ECOWAS, they say, well, no, this should not be just for Francophone. And as a matter of fact, when I had a discussion with Christian de Boissieu, and you know that Christian de Boissieu is working closely with Macky Sall, the president of Senegal, on this, and he's also part of this. They say, well, let's just go with the safer zone instead of thinking about. So these are the kind of issue we're having. We have a lot of issue there. As you also say, there are some countries which are conflict affected. Some of them are dealing with very difficult situations. So we're trying to bring all this, and we haven't decided yet on the best approach. But from the first discussion we had, we were saying it will be very difficult for us to just say, well, let's focus on the safer zone countries and do like what you guys did on the ESM. And Nicola and his team were very, very supportive to say, well, just try what you can do. Now, the problem is, at the same time that we want to put this thing in place, there are a lot of issues coming, like, for instance, the food crisis. So as you mentioned, how is this a priority? From my perspective, it's a priority because keep in mind that by 2023, so next year, in 2024, there are few African countries which may not be able to pay their coupon on their debt because they issue a lot of bonds on the market. There are big coupons coming in 2023 and 2024. If we don't act now, then they may be in a big trouble. So the point that you mentioned, I fully agree. Take it, and we're going to come back. These are the discussions we are having. For him, suggestion, I think this is a very good suggestion, as a matter of fact. And I say that Rim is actually interacting with me. Hopefully, she will join the team if she has some time. So I think all these things really good. And Rim, there was this issue about the SDR that we mentioned, and I know that also actually the first thing we also mentioned it. What I wanted to say is that out of the 650 billion, Africa got only 33 billion, less than 5%. See, and if you look at the recent development as the IMF, they came up with 3 proposals on the table. They say, well, the reallocation that President Macron, the rechanneling of SDR that President Macron was calling the so-called target of $100 billion US. They say, fine, but we want first to go to the PRGT and the RST. You see, PRGT, the target is something like 48 billion. And RST is something like 45 billion. That's the number I got in the last report by the IMF in the context of their spring meeting. And if you do the math, 48 plus 45 is 93. So basically only 7 billion will be left for rechanneling to MDB, Multilateral Development Bank, you see, like African Development Bank. And so this issue has been ongoing. I was actually in the room when President Adesina had the conversation with Christine Lagarde on asking Europeans to rechannel part of the SDR to African countries. And Christine Lagarde made it clear. She said, well, the problem we have is the so-called 123 article of the European Central Bank, which actually prevents this kind of thing to occur because it will be viewed as a monetary financing of fiscal deficit, you see? So we are completely stuck. So even if the African Development Bank is a prescribed holder of the SDR, I'm not expecting us to, I'm not sure we will get it, you see? And that's also our concern today. and in particular because the IMF staff are putting upfront the so-called reserve asset status of the SDR. They're kind of saying that we are not sure that the reserve asset status of the SDR will be maintained if the SDR were channeled to other, like the mutual development bank, mean outside the IMF. To finish, I think Paulo raised an important point. This issue of how do we bring the private sector? It's a big issue we are having. As I was saying, even when our countries actually go to even negotiate the coupons or profiling of the debt, they are not getting good deal. You see, they are kind of resisting, in particular to the Chinese who don't want to be on the table. We had that discussion with them. They don't necessarily favor this kind of discussion about. The Europeans are more willing to help, but all these non-Paris Club creditors like China, India, I can tell you it's tough. It's a very tough discussion. You see, so my point here is to say that it will be very difficult. I won't say that I'm completely discouraged, but I'm not expecting too much, to be honest with you, from the common framework of debt treatment. I'm not expecting too much. And as a matter of fact, I was mentioning in my introductory remark, I was completely discouraged when I saw the statement by Kristalina and David Malpass. See, they kind of, I won't say that they gave up, but basically they were saying that it will be very difficult to bring the private sector on the table to have this discussion. See, it's very difficult. That's the major differences between what we had in the context of the HIPIC, the MDRI, and what we have now. See, and as a matter of fact, I was lucky enough when I was at the IMF staff. That was back in 2000, I think 2003, something like that. And I went to the IMF board to help one of my friends, Barreau Chambrier, who was the ED at that time for the Francophone. I spent 2 years at the IMF board. I was senior advisor to the IMF board. And when we brought the debt relief for, I think it was Ethiopia or DRC. DRC was something like 10 to 12 billion US dollar of debt relief under the HIPIC and the MDRI. The Americans, they made it clear to us that we don't want this kind of initiative to come back because of the risk of the moral hazard. So keep in mind that the DSSI, even the common framework, also have in the background what's happened in 2005. You see, because where most of these countries benefited from debt relief, and we don't even know if they use it. So let me just stop here. I won't say that I'm discouraged, but I think African, we should not expect too much. I think what I would suggest, and this is what the point I'm making, is how do we work with European, you see, in particular on this European stability mechanism, so that you guys can help, you see, and to create this, and as Rim was saying, very quickly. I know that as Kari was mentioning, before going to a permanent mechanism, you guys created a temporary mechanism, just the fund, you see. Perhaps this approach we can use very quickly to create, because my concern is 2023 in 2024, which is just in the corner. We may have countries which has completely, they cannot pay, and they are bankrupt, they want to bankruptcy. And that's something we should avoid. Let me stop here.
Thanks a lot, Emmanuel, for being so frank, I have to say, on the situation, and to have actually such a clear picture. I would like to move to Erika, because Emmanuel mentioned several times the issue of the rechanneling of the SDR, and also the role of the EU was called several times. So maybe your thoughts or your view on these 2 points?
Thanks a lot, Cinzia, and thanks for the very good discussion. I may also widen a little bit on other topics if you allow. Well, so on the SDR, I think Emmanuel has described the situation exactly the way it is. Indeed, for now, rechanneling pledges have reached 74 billion, as I was saying in my introductory remarks, and are so far only addressed to the PRGT and the RST, because the third avenue, which we all looked at with a lot of interest at the beginning. The third avenue, unfortunately, does not seem to fly exactly for the reasons that Emmanuel was indicated, and this is indeed valid for the European countries, but it's not only the European countries that are limited by this constraint set on the liquidity asset rules of the SDRs. So this is really something that is for now putting a bit of a halt to the third option for the rechanneling, and this is why we are still hoping that despite this, that the PRGT, which is really the instrument to go and support the real poor countries and the ones that really now need support in view of, especially with the food crisis now looming, that this option will be financed, and as well as the RST, which is the holding this capacity to also refinance middle-income countries. I would also like to say a few words on the role of private sector and how we as EU are intending to work with the private sector in the context of this 150 billion Europe-Africa investment package, and the way we want to work now with guarantees. And I will be very short, otherwise, it could go on forever. But essentially, there will be two arms to this. There will be there is a sovereign guarantee mechanism for which we are working with through the EIB, and there is what we call the open architecture, for which we work with development finance institutions, and this is really in order to support private sector investment in our partner countries, and mostly, but not only in Africa, because as Paolo rightly put it, the money is out there in the private financial sector, and the money is looking for ways to be useful and to also be more advantageous for the investors. And this is why we are also working on what we call a green bond initiative, a European green bond initiative, which we would like to, or global green bond initiative, we call it, which exactly would be aiming at calling upon this financing from the financial sector and rechanneling this for investments in Africa. So this would be using this European guarantee from the FSD Plus, so the European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus, which is this guarantee mechanism which we have put in place now in the context of the multi-annual financial framework. And then finally, we spoke about debt transparency, and indeed, this is something that is also very important to us. We are also supporting and following the efforts made to enhance private sector debt transparency with the IF initiative now being hosted by the OECD. It is not an easy task, indeed, but it should remain an objective, because it is only with this private sector debt transparency that we will also manage to get Chinese debt transparency, which for now also is lacking. And a very final point, debt transparency is also linked to debt management, and what we are really focusing on in our own support and working with UNCTAD and the World Bank IMF debt management facility is to reinforce the management of the countries, of the administrations in Africa to manage their debt, to negotiate proper contracts, to put the collective action clauses in the debt contracts and in the deals, to have the overview of what the situation is. So the better the countries will be equipped to know what they have out there, the less the risks will be that we go into a major debt crisis. Thanks.
Thanks, Erika. I would like to go to Paolo again quickly, because the role of the private sector was mentioned several times, but also, I mean, going back to what Emmanuel said at the beginning, I mean, the debt in African countries have been growing over time, so it's not only COVID, this was a trend, and the counterpart compared to the past became really the private sector. So private sector has been investing in Africa. So the structure of the debt has changed. Even the currency composition has changed quite a lot. So my concern, which I think reflects the concern of many, is that with the environment changing and the risk perception changing, the private sector may just withdraw from these countries, really at the very moment when there is need for more support for someone financing debt. Paolo, besides the context that would be favorable for the private sector to remain there, what the private sector can contribute, or what can we think about for not withdrawing, so generate a cascade of defaults, basically?
Well, Cinzia, thank you. I think you raised a question that pushes me to point out that there is an elephant in the room, and the war. This is the war. And we should not forget that the war has been a game changer, has been a watershed. I mean, we were talking about the summit. That was before the war. Now we are living in it's affecting not only Eastern Europe, but also the Europe-Africa relations. I mean, it has had a direct impact on Africa. I don't need to mention that. You know, the commodity prices, inflation, food security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also, I would point out the longer term and indirect consequences, because in relation particularly to the future of globalization, the risk of deglobalization. You see, Africa has benefited a lot. You know, we have brought in Asia, but also in Africa, millions of people out of poverty, and in truth, I mean, we had very promising signs of recovery after COVID, and then the disruptions of the war. Now, there are two approaches basically. One is, you know, if you want, I can call it the nostalgic. That you know, we need somehow to keep the world order as it is, with all its problems, and push reforms here and there. Frankly, I think the view from the private sector you asked, it doesn't look very optimistic. I mean, we'll see what happens at the WTO ministerial meeting. You know, WTO, the jewel of the 1990s, with this dispute resolution. And I mean, if we have trade and if you resolve dispute through global mechanisms, we would have less wars. Now, we have a war, and the dispute settlement mechanism, the WTO, is blocked. The UN is split. The G20 is having difficulty after, you know, the promising. So I don't want to dramatize it, and certainly we need to push in that direction. But I think we need to find a practical, pragmatic plan B, if you want, kind of solutions of the kind that Rim was talking about. I believe, frankly, in geostrategic regionalism. I think, you know, you can call it in different ways: friend shoring, democratic alliance. There are various ways of presenting it, but I think, you know, we need innovative mechanisms based on public-private partnerships, bottom up, and that draw on proximity, and that aim at rebuilding trust and credibility. And it's here that I put Europe, as you have done. And I really praise you for organizing this meeting on Europe-Africa partnership. I think here Europe has a lot to give and a lot to take. I mean, because Europe means soft power, because Europe means bottom-up integration, because Europe has a tradition of looking at supranational mechanisms, which, let's be frank, I mean, the Anglo-Saxon world has a difficulty there. Look at Brexit and the Court of Justice, look at the appellate body. So I think, you know, for many reasons, I think Europe should take the responsibility towards its large and most important neighbor, that is Africa. I see here three very promising signals. First of all, the unblocking of the enlargement. I mean, we probably have important news in the following few days, but I think, you know, the war has unblocked and will unblock the enlargement process. And I think, you know, this, I call it the Peter Pan syndrome of the European Union, that it's not able to grow, it's not able to and grow up to its responsibilities. So we're going to see an interesting time where, you know, Europe, I mean, the America is working very effectively with 50 member countries. So it's not really the number of member countries. So we will unblock enlargement. And I also make a plea. I think we will look towards Eastern Europe, but we should also look to the Euro-Mediterranean. I know it's a country's responsibility. They have to apply. They have to see themselves as part. But I do hope that, as in the past, we will have also candidates coming from the Euro-Mediterranean. The second, the Euro-Mediterranean, the revival of this perspective after, frankly, the Barcelona process was killed, basically, because it became something completely different. I think we are going to see focus on the Euro-Mediterranean as a bridge towards Africa, and then Africa, Europe as a single region, if you want, as one neighborhood, extending this concept of neighborhood involving the whole of Africa. What is the implication? The implication is that we need integrated markets across Europe and Africa. We need to have in markets players great concern in relation to security, incorporate security in investment decisions, and even incorporate values in investment decisions. I mean, we are learning the importance of liberal democracy, human rights, and good governance. And this is something investors will look at, because I think this will make a difference in terms of the performance of investment decisions and risk management. So I think, on that, we need to avoid black swans. We need to have, and we will have investors more careful about those aspects. Does it mean weaponizing decisions, investment and financial markets, or politicizing them? Not necessarily so, but certainly this means introducing security and values also, as we have done with green finance. Introducing consideration, longer-term consideration linked to climate change and to sustainable development. So I think, Cinzia, we from the private sector, we need to have an approach that governance must, if they want to create a context in which the private sector can play its role, they have to have a holistic approach and take also into consideration these questions of security, values, and good governance.
Thanks a lot, Paolo. I would like now to move quickly to Kari, because we're supposed to finish it within a very few minutes. Kari, the last comment of Paolo is about governance. Maybe your reflection about how governance, to what extent governance matter when it comes to building new institutions.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for the question. I would still first like to just thank Emmanuel for pointing out the relation that actually my superior indeed has had with yourselves and some of our passionate ex-colleagues being involved in your project. That's very much appreciated. I think so. First, governance is certainly key. You would need to be able to organize a rescue mechanism around a well-defined legal entity identity for the financial reasons and the governance structure that can accommodate obviously all members and hopefully also integrate stakeholders more broadly in that framework. And this requires consensus on the objectives. I think this is really very important. And if you think about the debt type of an operation, one should also need to think about the operational side of it, in a sense that these need to be able to provide a realistic path to success for the country that is assisted. But one also needs to, this also means that it is minimizing too excessive repetitive use of the entity by the same member. And this requires early coordination as part of the governance arrangement. I would just say one more thing, Cinzia. I think it would be very important that there is sufficient level of harmonization that integrates, that a new entity can integrate within the ecosystem of the existing institutions. One should try and reach a level of plug and play if you want, and especially with the IMF, given their global role. That I think is very important part of the arrangement. And then you need maybe analytical and transactional partnerships to which I think Erika referred to in her comments. I will leave that for the interest of time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. And then I would like to give the floor to really for a bit of concluding our discussion. And maybe I think that there is a certain sympathy, at least in this group, for your proposal of really thinking in terms of more recovery, resilience, sustainability, something which requires partnership. My question is, it was highlighted that we live in a very peculiar moment where events actually are generating a sense of urgency, not only in related to the food crisis, but if you think of the situation in the Northern African countries, situation in Tunisia, in the MENA region in Lebanon. So quite a number of countries are really going through very difficult times. To what extent the situation in these countries could foster, maybe stimulating, or on the opposite, work as an obstacle towards supporting an initiative like the one that you propose?
Cinzia, a crisis must not be lost. So it is an opportunity to change and rebuild better. Based on that, perhaps some countries who have not been able to manage the external shocks, manage their internal idiosyncratic risks, manage I would say, the macroeconomic conditions that they have been into. Of course, the pandemic has not helped, the war in Ukraine neither. But we cannot forget that all these countries have been already touching the fragile states, and I think this did not help them at all to resist and to be resilient. Of course, there are some exceptions, and those exceptions everybody knows. But some of the other countries, they are very fragile, and most probably they will have to enter into a crisis. But then learning from a crisis, it's a nice learning, but then you have to deal with the costs, hopefully with some partnerships and some solidarities, the cost will be reduced. And this is what we have been discussing today, is to have a preemptive kind of mechanism that could stabilize and reduce the cost for the people, and also reduce the hardship for particularly the poor and other vulnerable populations. So for me, of course, we need to act fast and see and try to build on what has worked. I mean, the proposal I have, I have worked on, it's in fact coming from something that has been already done in Ghana. It's a guaranteed bond by the World Bank, and it has worked nicely. Of course, the problem there is eventually is to have better transparency of use of funds, and then better debt management, which was very much confirmed by Erika. But I think all of these are experiments that we learn from them and build upon them and try to take the opportunity. If we are in a crisis, we could enhance collective action towards more resilience and prosperity and peace. So this is the overall objective we want to achieve. So for me, there is an opportunity because we are moving into crisis conditions and we are almost there to build better and to build together. And this is what we want to put in place. Of course, I hope we are not going to lose this great opportunity, because I see this crisis as a great opportunity to build better. And I want to stop here.
Thanks a lot, Rim. We are already a few minutes over time, so I'm afraid we will have to close it here. But in the end, I think there is no better way to close with Rim gave us an optimistic message, and we really need an optimistic approach given the situation. I would like to thank very much really all the speakers. This has been a really very instructive and comprehensive discussion. I hope you appreciate it as well. Thanks very much. I think the idea is to have a picture, if I'm not wrong. So before we close, it would be nice to have it one.
And thank you, Cinzia, for the great moderation. Really, thank you very much.
Thanks to you. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Great. So we keep in touch.
We do.
Yeah, definitely. I may need your help. I will need your help.
I would like to ask all the participants who joined us today on this Zoom link to switch on their camera so we can have a group picture.
Yes.
Is it happening?
Indeed so. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks a lot, everyone, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon. Thanks.
Bye.